The scripture reading today is from Luke chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. Jesus told them a story showing that it was necessary for them to pray consistently and never quit. He said there was once a judge in some city who never gave God a thought and cared nothing for the people. A widow in that city kept after him, "My rights are being violated. Protect me." He never gave her the time of day. But after this went on and on, he said to himself, "I care nothing what God thinks, even less what people think. But because this widow won't quit badgering me, I'd better do something and see that she gets justice. Otherwise, I'm going to end up beaten black and blue by her pounding." Then the master said, "Do you hear what that judge, corrupted as he is saying? So what makes you think God won't step in and work justice for his chosen people who continue to cry out for help? Won't he stick up for them? I assure you, he will. He will not drag his feet, but how much of that kind of persistent faith will the Son of Man find on the earth when he returns?"
So we'll see how I do this morning. I've lost my voice this week, and the topic is on a woman who had no voice. So it's kind of interesting. So where are we? Is this the end of summer? Is it the start of fall? I'm feeling a little confused. Demarcation points used to be so much more defined. Seasons were marked by events and transitions and days on the calendar. It used to be pretty standard that school started after Labor Day, which is next week. But in our neighborhood, and as I talked to Emma, her school is already underway. And then there are some schools that are starting up after Labor Day, and some of our kids are on vacation before they have to be back at school. But I can guarantee that all the kids already in school, summer is long over. And for those starting after Labor Day, it's still summertime and the living is easy. What season is it for you today? So welcome to our sixth and final week of our Summer Stories series, where we've been diving into Jesus' favorite teaching method, telling stories, telling parables. Every parable is a story, but not every story is a parable. If you remember, parables are a particular kind of story. A brief, commonplace, unpretentious story is thrown into a conversation and lands at our feet, compelling notice. A parable is literally something thrown alongside of. Para means alongside, and bowl, as in bowling, means thrown. To which our first response is, what is this doing here? We ask questions, we think, we imagine. Parables appear in quick, precise strokes. A parable is actually feeble, though, and almost all the power is in the one who hears it. And then we begin seeing connections and how things are related. A parable is not ordinarily used to tell us something new, but to get us to notice something that we have overlooked, although it's been right there in front of us for years. So today, we're considering what has been titled the parable of the persistent widow. Raise your hand if you have experienced a situation where someone kept after you about something until you gave in to their request. If you're a parent, most likely you have had that experience, and maybe a husband too, probably lots of times. Okay, now raise your hand if you have ever been so persistent and unrelenting that someone else gave in to your request. So I have a confession this morning from my childhood, one that I only can laugh at about now. You see, when I was little, I had a serious mission. In an era and time where parents smoked, I was determined to keep my mom from smoking. Sorry, Mom, I didn't tell you I was going to tell this story. I didn't have a grand plan or a deep understanding of health risks. No, my strategy was a bit more mischievous. I became a master cigarette thief. Every time I saw a pack of cigarettes lying around, I'd sneak them away like a pint-sized ninja and hide them in the most ridiculous places. Under the couch cushions, inside my doll's wardrobe closet, even behind the cereal boxes in the pantry. I figured if she couldn't find them, she couldn't smoke them, right? Brilliant plan. At first, my mom was completely baffled. She would look everywhere for her missing cigarettes, muttering to herself about how they seemed to have developed legs and wandered off. Meanwhile, I'd be in the background, trying my best to look innocent, while also feeling like some kind of undercover hero. But after a few weeks of playing hide and seek with their cigarettes, something amazing happened. My mom finally got so fed up with the constant search and rescue missions that she threw her hands up in the air and said, "That's it, I'm done." And just like that, she quit smoking. I couldn't believe it. I had actually won. So this little story of my childhood antics brings to mind this parable in Luke 18, a bit darker, a bit more strange. In some ways, it feels like these stories are part of Jesus's pre-Garden of Gethsemane moment, a foreshadowing of the "take this cup away" plea that was to come. And yet these stories and the persistent widow's story are all part of filling in missing parts of a painting that has not yet been completed. And when is a painting completed? When the painter says so, and God the painter has not yet said so. And so we dive into the story. It seems pretty simple and straightforward. There's a judge who doesn't care what God thinks and really doesn't care what people think. There's a widow who kept coming back to him to ask for justice against someone who has wronged her. The judge is unmoved and immovable until he begins to get worn out by her constant badgering, and so he grants her justice. And Jesus says, "Won't God do the same for you?" And then the last line, and it could be seen as a very sad line: "When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" Do you know the other common title sometimes attributed to this parable? It's also called the parable of the unjust judge. How would you decide to title the parable? I guess it might depend on the vantage point from which you're looking. If you're the judge, you're thinking about the persistent widow badgering you over and over. If you were the widow, you're thinking about the unjust judge who has no compassion and no regard for others and no regard for what might be considered right in the eyes of God. So this summer, I've been trying to encourage you and persuade you to look beyond the typical Sunday school interpretations. Not because those interpretations are wrong, but because parables have the ability to go even deeper. And when we bring curiosity and willingness to remain open to new insights, when we bring our open hands, loose finger posture to the story and allow ourselves to suspend coming up with a singular interpretation of the story. Let the story work in you. Okay, so let's chat about some of the usual interpretations of the story. 1, the story is about the need to pray always and not lose heart. That's a good one. 2, this is a story about the corrupt systems of power and how the powerless are oppressed. That's a good one too. This is a story about the plea for justice and vengeance against someone who has wronged you. A wrong was done. Someone needs to pay for it. Those are some of the typical and obvious interpretations of this parable. But typical and obvious is not the way of Jesus. How often have we heard him say, "You have read such and such, but I say unto you." And then he proceeds to tell us something that flips the script, changes the orientation, reveals a bit more about the upside-down, inside-out reality about the nature of God. When contemplating this parable, author Michael March wrote this: Parables are supposed to surprise and shock us, but there's nothing surprising or shocking about the usual interpretations. Parables are supposed to interrupt business as usual. Parables are supposed to open our eyes to a new worldview, but the usual interpretations show us what we've already seen. So what are some of the other possible interpretations? One of my friends, Mark Davis, has an interesting take which comes out of an exegetical exercise of a deep dive into the study of the text in the original Greek. He says if we take Luke's interpretation at face value, we might conclude that God is like the judge, and we should pray like the widow until we get the answer we want. But in reality, God is not like the judge, because the judge has no regard for God or for people. The judge has no compassion. He says perhaps another way to read this parable is to do so in a way that prompts us to explore a redefinition of prayer. Prayer, he says, is not simply us talking to God, but it's an expression of a demand for justice. In The Hobbit, one is reminded that the word pray is not simply a religious term. When Bilbo continually asks forgiveness for offending Thorin upon their first encounter, Thorin finally answers, "Pray, don't mention it." The word pray, in its widest definition, is simply a plea from one to another. The demand for justice is often wearying and seems futile because the powers that be often act with impunity, as if there is no moral order to the universe and as if there is no respect that one ought to have that for humanity. However, persistence can be effective even in advocating for justice. In this sense, prayer would indicate not just our cries to God, but also our letters to the editor, our petitions to the city council, our protest marches, and our public proclamations. There will be vindication of the true and just, and there will be a slow, persistent journey of raising one voice over and over again. How else might this parable be interpreted? It still feels too obvious to think this is a story about nagging prayer to an unwilling God. Would we even want to pray to a God who has to be worn down by our constant nagging? Maybe this parable is about a God who understands our suffering and a God who joins in bearing our suffering with us. We bear it together in partnership. Embedded in this notion of our partnership with God, there's a spiritual truth that is inextricably linked to power, but not power the way the world thinks of power. It is power through weakness. It is power through surrender. That type of surrender to God is probably one of the most difficult spiritual concepts for us to embrace until we have no other choice. The Apostle Paul, when praying to be healed from what he called a thorn in my flesh, asked God 3 times to remove the thorn, and God did not take this away. Paul tells us, "But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness.'" God's power made perfect in the weakness of our widow. If we are in partnership with God, power is also present in our weakness. Weakness put into the hands of God turns to great hope. Weakness itself must be turned over, dedicated, put into the hands of God. Weakness, which is simply abdicated, is not the same subject. That comes in the category of despair, not humility. There's a difference between surrendering to God and quitting or giving up. Many of us who have had the humility enough to know our weaknesses, to surrender to God. It is on the road to despair where we find the presence of God in any magnitude. In the darkness, we see a hope and light we have never seen before and turn our lives over. The despair turns to great hope, and the energy flowing back in is greater than any we have ever known before. Only it is obvious it is not coming from us anymore. God's power works better through our weakness, because in our weakness, we let God in. Persistence in prayer is letting God in. Weakness leads to resurrection, which leads to ultimate hope. So how does justice come about? One thing seems certain. It does not seem like the God of all creation, the God of the universe, will act with impunity and break the laws of nature to give us what we think is justice. We have free will. All of us have free will. That means the righteous and the unrighteous. That means the good and evil. That means everyone. So how does justice come about? Justice requires a new way of thinking, a new way of understanding, a new way of loving. And it is precisely because new paradigms of belief, understanding, and action take a lot of time to change. It takes the voice of persistent widows to keep the evolution alive. How long did it take for the women's rights movement to achieve equality for all women? Probably the real answer is that it's still moving towards that goal. But we know that the women's suffrage movement in the United States started almost the day the United States declared its independence. For hundreds of years, this movement to justice has marched on. Shifts in consciousness occurred through many milestone points, like the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 led to state campaigns, court battles, and petitions to Congress, ultimately leading to the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, giving women the right to vote. In 1972, Title IX was signed into law that prohibited sex-based discrimination in educational settings, which opened up opportunities for women, particularly in collegiate sports. And I might put in, USA is playing tonight for the gold medal. If you care to watch, I'll give you info in the Pan American Cup. And the women are playing there, which is super exciting. So, my small commercial. All right. In matters of law, we would be hard to find pressed to find any era that the rights of women differ from the rights of men. And the consciousness of every person continues to evolve in expansive ways. And God has been there every step of the way, in partnership, bearing the burdens with those who have been oppressed or marginalized. Justice moves slowly, in part because awareness grows slowly. While God's response is always seeking justice, the realization of God's response is not immediate, cannot be immediate, because justice can only move forward with the willing cooperation of all those involved. Years ago, I knew a man who would lament about how slow people often were to understand a new paradigm or to change their minds when given new information. His line was, water seeps through concrete slowly. I think that is pretty true for almost all of us. It's hard for us to really enter into this story and realize just how subversive it was for Jesus to set this story with the widow as a central voice seeking justice. In Judaism, to set this story about a widow would have been just unheard of. But in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, there's an emphasis on the importance of caring for widows, orphans, and foreigners, because God cares about them the same as for every other human being. In the case of looking at equal rights for women, even though it might be the law, it also might not always be the reality. In Jesus' time, Jewish law also required care for those most vulnerable, like widows, orphans, and foreigners. despite that being the law was not always the reality. And even if she did, would the judge take her seriously and listen to her case? The widow would have no rights and would never have an audience in front of a judge. Now, of course, in this story, the answer was no. At least it was no. She didn't have a voice until it was too inconvenient to continue to say no. Jesus has positioned the widow not as a helpless and powerless woman, but as an active and aggressive agent seeking justice. This is a framework of profound theological and practical application for anyone who is marginalized. This is a model of how the power to effect change is found in our weakness, not in our surrender to others, not in the abdication of action, in the surrender to God, who then joins us in partnership. For the widow, rather than waiting passively for someone to come to her aid, she takes matters into her own hands. Rather than being meek and resigned to her fate, this widow is using the tools she has available: her voice, her persistence, and her courage. We've looked at this story from several different angles and perspectives. So how are we to interpret this parable? We've thought about a lot of different perspectives and ways to think about this parable. So this is your time to write your own sermon on this parable. And this is your story to contemplate this week. For the next week, I invite you to read this story every day, Luke 18, 1-8, and ask God in prayer for insight for what this story might mean to you and for you right now. Are there injustices around you that you tolerate without making any comment? When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? How could it be otherwise if we are paying attention at all? God is bearing our burdens with us. God joins us in our persistent widow voices being raised. And God is the God of justice. Are we ready to do our part when God takes action? The need for constant prayer is not to make sure God finally understands how desperate we are. This isn't about pestering and wearing God down with our prayers or suggesting God doesn't want to respond. It's about our God who deeply shares in and carries the burdens of our human suffering alongside us. Prayer isn't about giving God a to-do list. Prayer is not to change God. The need for constant prayer is to transform us. Do you remember G.K. Chesterton's response to the newspaper editorial column asking the question, "What's wrong with the world?" Chesterton wrote to the editor of the newspaper, and his letter said this: "Dear sirs, what's wrong with the world? I am. Sincerely, G.K. Chesterton." Upside down, inside out, Jesus told us this is the way God works. Jesus showed us this is the way God works. Death is inevitable. Resurrection is a choice. Each day we rise again. Each day we raise our voice against injustice. Each day we say yes to participating with God in the world. May we too be persistent in our prayers, for persistence lets God in. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Absolutely. Amen.